All right. Well, welcome to day two of the Sloan Sports Analytics Conference. We're thrilled to have Evan Wasch, who's the SVP of Basketball Analytics and Strategy at the NBA, here with us this morning to discuss his presentation on unlocking the potential of the NBA schedule. So without further ado, I'll kick it up to Evan for the presentation. Thanks.
Thanks, Kyle, and thanks everyone for joining today. Kyle was actually my intern at the NBA last summer, so I'm honored to be introduced by him today. Just want to say, as a Sloan alum, I'm thrilled to be back here, and I think what the current organizers have done is really incredible for this 10th anniversary, so big congratulations to everything they pulled off here. So we're going to talk about the NBA schedule today, obviously a topic that gets quite a bit of attention in the press, so some of this stuff might be not so new, some more insightful. I'm going to try to probably talk for about 20, 25 minutes and leave a few minutes at the end for questions, so if you have those, I'll try to answer them as best I can. Before jumping into the meat of how we've done the schedule, right, and I'm going to talk about the past, present, and future of NBA scheduling, I thought it would be interesting to share a story about where we've come from. So I went back and looked at the 1967-68 schedule, and specifically identified a 5-game stretch that the Seattle Supersonics played that season to try to get a sense of what travel, road trips, and things looked like at the time. And keep in mind as I go through this, there were no charter planes back then. This was all commercial travel, right? So on Friday, December 22nd of that season, Seattle played a home game against the Warriors, I believe. They then traveled the next day to Oakland for, in fact, effectively a home-and-home, before flying back to Seattle for a game the following day. They then flew to Cincinnati for a game the very next day, on Christmas Day, in fact, against the Cincinnati Royals, so you know how far back we're going. And finally ended this 5 games in 5 nights odyssey in Philadelphia, interesting, playing the New York Knicks. And why Seattle and the Knicks were playing in Philadelphia, we won't get into, but it obviously shows we've come a pretty long way here. And just think about that in the context of how we schedule our games today. And even further, I wanted to get a sense of what it was actually like to play in these games. So coincidentally, NBA legend, player, GM, league executive Rod Thorne was on this Seattle Supersonics team. So I reached out to Rod and I said, Rod, can you give a sense of how it was on your body or performance to play 5 games in 5 nights in effectively 5 different cities? And Rod wrote back and he said, well, by the warm-ups of the 4th game, I couldn't feel my legs, and those last 2 games were brutal. But then in typical Rod fashion, he finished up by saying, but man, those were the days. So I said, okay, so maybe we should look at doing that today. But so to take a step back, right, every sport faces unique challenges in creating a schedule. For the NBA, those challenges include player health and wellness, travel, local business considerations, national television windows, and building availability. And what's interesting is, in some sense, this is a huge math problem, right? Because what we're trying to do is schedule 1,230 games in 29 buildings across a roughly 170-day season. And it turns out if you run the sort of combinatorics calculations on that, there are more ways to do that than there are atoms in the universe. And in fact, it's not even close. And I think I was shocked when I first heard that stat, and I've run the numbers a bunch of times just to confirm it because it sounds outrageous, but it is. And it really comes down to just, you think about all the optionality you have, even with an individual team schedule, which is scheduling 82 games in 170 days. It's just an astronomical number. So we looked at this and said, we've always looked at it and said, what's the best mathematical way to solve this? And it's interesting because it's a problem that's long been studied in academic literature. For example, there's something called the traveling tournament problem that looks a lot like this at its core. But even math aside, there's no such thing as a perfect schedule, right? Because you've got all these different stakeholders and considerations, so there's a significant human component to what we're trying to accomplish as well. And our overall goals as a league, when we create a schedule, are to maximize the health and wellness of our players, maintain competitive fairness and opportunity for all 30 teams, and then ultimately support business opportunities both at the local, national, and global level where we can. So how did we build this schedule historically? For the last 30 years, the schedule creation was led by longtime NBA executive Matt Winnick. And we had some external consulting support from Bortz Media. But for the majority of Matt's time, there were really limited technological tools available. And we kept adding analytics and support of that nature over time, but it was a primarily manual process, right? And what that meant is we would look game by game and say, what's the best place to schedule this individual game? And there was a process to it. So the first step typically would be, how do we build a national television schedule? Because that tends to be informed by other factors that lead into the season. So for example, we have a semi-standard policy that the champion one year will get to play at home either opening night or Christmas the following year. Right? Opening night, typically we do a ring ceremony or a Christmas Day game. So take this year's example. Golden State won the championship. We had them at home on Christmas against Cleveland, which of course then means Cleveland's going to be on a West Coast road trip at that time. So if you start to fill in these national television windows, you have some sense of where teams need to be at any point in the year, and you can start to structure longer road trips around that. So that was step one. Step two would be building the cross-conference games or longer travel games, because again, those would typically be scheduled around times when a team needed to be out of its building for a long stretch. So obvious examples would be San Antonio with their rodeo trip. Other teams have Disney on Ice or circuses or college basketball tournaments in their buildings, so you'd look at scheduling long road trips around those types of things. And then ultimately you fill in the near-in games, the divisional games where it might be easier to get from a New York to Philly on any given day and play that game. And so that's how we do it, right? We'd place the games kind of one by one, tracking them as we go, looking at the analytics and seeing what the best way to create the schedule is. And truthfully, given the tools available throughout this time, the schedules that Matt created through this primarily manual approach are incredible. There was continual improvement in the key metrics like back-to-backs. We satisfied all these different constraints, and it really was a sort of very enviable process. So Matt really laid the groundwork for where we are today. And when he retired after the creation of the 14-15 schedule, we said, you know, what could we do, what could we leverage that he's done and perhaps take to the next level? And it turns out we put in place a cross-functional team. We decided it would take 5 people to replace Matt's singular expertise. And that team's led by Tom Corelli from the league's broadcasting department. But it has representatives from basketball operations, strategy, broadcasting, and team marketing and business operations, or TEAMBO. And the key is each team member brings a different stakeholder view to the table. So we're making sure that we're factoring in the needs of our players, GMs and coaches, team business personnel, our broadcast partners, and the folks who manage our buildings as they look at scheduling their arenas and other events they have. And when we did our first schedule, which is this 15-16 season, we said, well, what should we focus on? And not surprisingly, there's a lot of chatter around the science of player health and wellness, rest and recovery. So we explicitly focused on back-to-backs and 4 and 5s around scheduled density. And in some sense, back-to-backs are a mathematical reality of our calendar. We play 82 games in 170 days, so you're playing roughly every other day, or 3.5 games a week, which means every time you take 2 days off coming back from a West Coast road trip, if you're an East Coast team, that's a back-to-back somewhere else in the calendar. Every time a team has 3 days off at a particular point in the season because they might want to get a practice in late in the year as they prepare for a playoff run, that's 2 back-to-backs somewhere else in the calendar. And every time you come home from a trip and maybe you wanted to play Tuesday night in your building, but there's a Lady Gaga concert, and so we now need to play Wednesday, that's another back-to-back. So you look at all these things and you said, well, what are the addressable levers? What can we do given the construct that we have to try to reduce some of these things? And we identified 2 primary drivers. One was national television windows, and the other was arena availability. So with our national TV windows, historically we've had fairly limited slate of games on Thursday nights in the TNT window, and limited on Sunday afternoon in the ABC window. So we worked with our TV partners and we said, wouldn't it be better if we played potentially a few more games in those windows, which would accomplish 2 things. One, it would let us spread the density out, right? Because if you think about a Thursday night that only has 2 or 3 games, that actually means the majority of the league is playing its 3.5 games in a 6-day window instead of a 7-day window, which of course will lead to back-to-backs. So we said not only that, late in the year it's actually going to be beneficial for our partners in the league in general because we'll now have the opportunity to flex into some of those games if a more attractive matchup emerges as we go late in the season. So we did that this season. We significantly increased the number of games in those windows. And then we also, as I said, looked at the building availability, and we said, can we get more information from our arenas? Instead of just saying, tell us the days you're available, it was, tell us everything we need to know or would want to know about your building. When do you have confirmed events? When do you have events that may end up being confirmed but are not yet? Where's the flexibility? And then understanding the business implications. Because maybe there's not such a big difference between a Tuesday night and a Wednesday night, or a Friday and a Saturday in some markets for some opponents. And that flexibility really helps when you're talking about sort of very small movements with games that can alleviate back-to-backs. And turns out we were pretty successful. So we looked comparing to last year, and we were able to reduce the number of back-to-backs from about 19.3 per team down to 17.8. And the max came down from 22 to 20. And we reduced the average number of 4 and 5s even more starkly, from 69 across the whole league down to 27, an average of under 1 per team, again, bringing the max from 4 down to 2. And we like to say that no team had the daily double of 20 back-to-backs in 2, 4, and 5. So we were sort of focused on the parity across the different metrics. Interestingly, these were all-time lows for the league. So at no point in league history had we gotten down to these numbers. So it really was sort of a pretty great accomplishment. But these were just the public headlines, right? There's lots of other things we focused on, looking at more advanced metrics that track performance of teams and business opportunities. And one, for example, that's gotten some attention is this notion of relative rest. So we look at a metric we call fresh, tired, and even, which essentially tracks on any given night which of the two teams played the night before, and does one have a relative rest advantage? And we try to keep that within acceptable ranges as well, understanding the competitive implications. So that said, even with the historical lows we had this year, and even with the strides we were able to make in those different levers, we thought that there's still room for improvement. And specifically, we still had this process of creating one schedule, which, again, potentially a better schedule than we've had, but limits our flexibility, right, and limits our ability to respond when different structural changes happen. So who might win a championship, or where a key free agent signs, which could change our national television windows. And so we went back and said, well, what could we do differently? How can we reapproach this in a new way? And we partnered with KPMG and their analytics practice to essentially build from scratch a new scheduling system. And at the core of this system is mathematical optimization capabilities. And it may seem obvious that, well, of course you should be using optimization for an NBA schedule, but the problem is so large, and the search space of possible schedules is so immense that traditional optimization techniques just wouldn't work in this case. And so it really was a nuanced issue we were trying to address here. And specifically what this system does is it ingests user-defined constraints, which we, the scheduling team, will feed in and say, these are the things we're either trying to achieve or trying to avoid in any given season schedule. It then takes those constraints, searches through, again, this nearly infinite search space, and says, what are the schedules or set of schedules that will best satisfy those constraints, and then feed them back to us for review and iteration. And I'm going to give you a first public view of this system today. And so keep in mind, we haven't even used it for a full season schedule yet, so we're just really in early testing, experimenting phase. This will be the first look anyone's seen into it, and no need to Instagram or Facebook or Snapchat, anything. Everything you're going to see is a mock-up version of next year's schedule, so you're not getting the actual first look at where we'll play the games, just how the system will work. So I'll take you through kind of step-by-step how we'll do this. So as I said, the first step is building these constraints. And we're showing a few examples here, and constraints can fall in any one of a number of categories. So for example, I'll read from the top here, right? A business constraint might be prevent teams from playing the same opponent in the same home location during any 7-day period. It's essentially saying we're not going to have the Celtics and the Knicks play in Boston twice in the same week. Seems pretty obvious, but computer, of course, wouldn't know to do that unless you told it to. Then we're going to have structural constraints, like saying prevent road trips of effectively one game, right, between one and one game from crossing 2 time zones. And it turns out that's a collective bargaining constraint. We're not allowed to have sorry, it's not a collective bargaining constraint. We have one on back-to-backs. But we would say we're not going to send a team across 2 time zones, play one game, and then come right home. It just wouldn't make a lot of sense. And then we might have a travel constraint, like saying we want to reduce the number of overall back-to-backs, right, across different travel distances and time zones and such. And at the end of the day, we're going to have literally hundreds of constraints that we're feeding into this system. And the constraints will be some league-wide around these sort of structural issues that we're facing, and some team-specific, either about their building or about their particular scheduling preferences. And we feed them all in, and the key for us as the humans in this process is the relative prioritization of these constraints. And every constraint gets a penalty value. And that penalty value tells the system how important that constraint is relative to everything else. And so the things that are what we call showstoppers or hard constraints might be, guess what? Don't schedule a game when the building isn't available. If there's a rodeo in San Antonio, don't schedule a game there. That's going to get the highest possible penalty value. Similarly, don't play 3 games in 3 nights. We might have done it in 1967. We don't anymore. Don't allow any schedule to come back that violates that constraint. Whereas some other things might be nice to haves, right? So we might say, hey, if an East Coast team's going to go on a West Coast road trip, we'd like them to play at least 3 teams while they're out there for efficiency's sake. Are we going to eliminate any schedule where they maybe play 2 of those teams and then stop in Texas on the way back to the East Coast? Maybe not, but it's still something we try to avoid, so we give it a high but not infinite penalty. So we feed all those in, and the optimizer then takes these constraints and starts to search through the search space of schedules. And it's evaluating literally billions of schedules at any given moment. And I mentioned before that trying to get through this search space is this really, really challenging problem, and it doesn't use traditional multi-integer programming or linear programming solutions because we'd be sitting here for billions of years waiting for one schedule to come back. It's just not a feasible way to do this. So instead, the system uses heuristics, specifically something called simulated annealing, which is a pretty interesting approach where it bounces around the search space looking for areas that are promising, right? An area that might show a score that's lower than a score that it found in some other area, and when it does, it'll dive deeper into that area, explore it for a while, and then perhaps explore other areas. The result is we might not get the absolute lowest score in the entire search space, but we're going to get one that's pretty close, and we're going to get it in a much more efficient time frame. And when we do this, schedules will literally start coming back in 5 or 10 minutes. So we press optimize, the system goes out, and all of a sudden it'll start returning schedules, and you can see this line tracking the score as we go. They get better over time, right? So it starts dropping down, it starts to level off, and it says, all right, I've kind of stopped improving in this area. I'm going to bounce up. I'm now going to accept a worse score to explore a different area of the search tree, see if I can find something better. And just to pause here, what you're seeing is that this system is really incorporating massive computational power at any given second, and as you'll see and continue to see, really complex user interfaces for us at the League to work with this. So this is as much a technological development solution as it is a purely mathematical one. So let's say we've run this for 10 minutes or so, and now we're down to this, in this case, a score of 36-10, and we say, okay, well, let's start to look at a schedule. So we can dive into any one of these. And again, this is the part where you don't have to put this on social media because it's not real. But this is a schedule that came out, and this actually has a much higher score, so it's not even from that list. And we can then try to digest this schedule. And one thing we learned pretty quickly is it's actually really hard to digest 1,230 games at once. There's no obvious user interface view that's going to show you 1,230 games that a human's going to look at and go, yeah, that's a good schedule. Right? Like, I don't even know how to begin to look at this other than saying that it looks like those West Coast teams are playing too many home games in a row, as shown by the depth of those blue colors, which show the home-away split. But what we can look at is some of the key metrics. So across the top there, and it's a little fuzzy here, but we're showing the number of back-to-backs, 4 and 5s, fresh tire, distance, et cetera, weekend games. And we can see, well, what's the average? What's the minimum? What's the maximum? Because we're obviously very focused on creating fair schedules across all 30 teams. And how does that compare to other things we've done? So is that the best we've got in this run? Is it better than last year? Is it worse? What's the trade-offs, right? So have we run a schedule that instead of 17.8 back-to-backs now has 16.8 back-to-backs per team? But what was the cost? Did it mean 2,000 more miles per travel? 2,000 more miles traveled per team? Is that a trade-off we want to make? Is it not? It's a conversation with the league, with the teams, to understand how those things matter to everyone involved. And what we can do here is we can say, we like this schedule, but maybe there's some aspects we don't like. And what we can do from that point is we can go back to the optimizer and say, you know what? I want to tweak my constraint. I want to say this thing that I previously thought was important maybe isn't as important, or this thing that I previously didn't include turns out is really important, and I want to add or remove or modify the constraints. Ultimately, we're mixing what we call the constraint cocktail, and the idea is how do you create that best cocktail that results in the schedules you want to see. And so it's really an iterate and refine process where the schedules come back, humans analyze, feedback to the optimizer, and we go through that process. And what's also interesting is not just understanding the league-wide view, but digging into any individual team, right? So if I were to click any one of these teams, I can see their team schedule. I can see their metrics compared to the last few years, their metrics compared to the league. And one of our favorite screens that I'll show you is we can even look at any individual road trip to try to understand how efficient it is. So I picked a Houston road trip, I guess mostly as a threat to Daryl that we would send him on this road trip if he doesn't give us the information we want. But so here's a road trip that starts in Houston. First game is out in Phoenix. And the planes show you, the color of the plane tells you whether you're crossing a time zone west to east or east to west. And the number of dots in the plane tell you how many days off you have between those games. So we've got 1 day off heading to Phoenix. We've got 1 day off heading Phoenix all the way up to Boston. 1 day off Boston down to Atlanta. 2 days off Atlanta across to Utah. And then it looks like a back-to-back home back to Houston. So this is never a road trip that we would send Houston on. But what's interesting here is this is one of the challenges as we build the system. Any human can look at this and say, well, that's crazy. You'd never do that. But how do you teach the computer that that's not an optimal road trip? There's a lot of factors here. Is it the number of flights? Is it the distance of the flights? Is it crossing the time zones? Is it the directional travel? All of those things can be boiled down essentially into programming language to say, here are the types of road trips we like, and here are the types of road trips we don't like. Obviously, the optimal road trip for any given team is you fly to a particular region, you play a few games in that region, and you fly home. But that's not always going to be feasible. So maybe it's you fly to a region, you play a couple of games, but on your way home, you're flying over some other city. So you stop and play a game there. How do you teach that in a constraint to the optimizer? So these user interfaces are just incredibly valuable for us as we try to parse through all these different issues and how we can ultimately create the best schedule. So lastly, what's great about this is it really gets us out of this world of creating one schedule, one puzzle solution to the effectively infinite search space. Instead, we can start to do scenario planning. So as this year's playoffs evolve and we say, all right, we're in the conference finals, there's 4 potential teams that could win the title, and we have a sense of what we would do in each of those cases. So again, if Golden State wins, they're going to play at home on these dates. We can run all those different scenarios and say, as those things happen, we know it's a little more plug and play, so that when the information emerges, we're ready to go instead of scrambling to make the changes at the last minute, which I think will make for better conversations with our teams as well. So it's really just a huge leap forward for us as a league. We're tremendously optimistic about where this is going to take us. It's really difficult for us to define what constitutes a better schedule, given that all the trade-offs involved. But based on preliminary testing of the system, we've actually seen that we think we can further improve a lot of these key metrics given the current construct. And frankly, not all of them are going to be obvious to the casual observer, but we think we'll, in the long run, create a much better product for our teams, for our fans, for our media partners. So we're really excited about where we're going. So I'm going to pause there, and I think we have about 5 minutes left. I'll take some questions. Right there.
How do you account for non-game revenue or demand during weekday, weekend? And some teams might complain that they have too many weekday games or they don't make enough money in sessions. And then a second question, have you talked to the other leagues? Like hockey has a similar schedule, baseball is more complicated.
Yeah. We absolutely. So first question first. We work very closely. So with team marketing and business operations is the department of the league that works closely with the teams on ticket sales. The first thing I'd say is that you'd actually be surprised. Over time, our teams have done such a better job at ticket sales that the gap between a Saturday night and a Monday night has really narrowed. It still matters. And so I talked a lot about the travel and density issues. We're very focused on the team stuff as well. And one of the key metrics on that headline was the weekend games, right? So are we giving a fair number of weekend games to every team? By the nature of it, right, everyone's going to get their fair share of Saturdays, Fridays, et cetera. But what's interesting is every market is different. So one particular market might say, you know what, Thursdays are everyone's Saturdays is the best for everyone. But someone might say Thursdays is my second best night. Someone else might say Sundays is my second best, which is a nice synergy then because we can try to schedule specific to those teams. So we look at that a lot. And then the other leagues, as we went through this process to look for a partner to build our new system, we spent an extensive amount of time with all three leagues, sort of without jumping into their processes. You know, both the NFL and baseball use similar systems with vendors who provide services along these lines. Hockey's actually been done in conjunction sort of with us, the same vendor, the past few years, because if you think about it, we're sharing buildings, so there's a lot of synergy there. I would say our problem is actually uniquely complex in that we're solving so many different challenges. Football, for example, isn't dealing with building availability issues as much incredibly smaller, size of schedule size in terms of number of games. Baseball, if you think about it, you're not really scheduling 162 games. You're scheduling 55 series because that's how they play the game. So not to say ours is harder than others. It probably has more factors than you might imagine for some of the other leagues. Sure, so the question was how do we deal with cancellations or we have to change the date of a game? It's a great question. Historically, we've just said we've had weather issues, for example, this year, the big snowstorm on the East Coast forced us to move a couple games. Essentially what we do is we'll take the two teams involved, we'll look at their schedules the remainder of the year, and when you try to map out, well, what are days when neither team is playing, the building where you need to play the game's available, and they could feasibly get there travel-wise. Turns out you don't actually have that many options. So we'll, 3, 4, 5 options. We'll talk through that with the teams. If it would be an issue for the players, we'll talk to the players union as well. I think what's great about the system that we're building here is it'll actually start to make recommendations, right? So if a weather pattern's coming in and we're like, these 4 games are potentially going to be an issue, before we even make that decision, we can now go in and say we know what the shift is going to be because it's told us, for example, what's the lowest penalty move to take that game and place it somewhere else.
Miami played a lot of pro games in January, right before Chris Bosh and playoffs and stuff. Is that something you're going to be looking into when you come up with a schedule for next season?
Sorry,
I said Miami played a lot of road games in January, right before Chris Bosh came down with playoffs. Is improving the schedule to kind of lessen the length of those kind of road trips something you look into for next season?
Yeah, so a lot of times long road trips are just a function of building availability. So in that case, Miami has the circus in the American Airlines Arena in January, so they have to be out of their building for roughly a 2-week stretch. Whether they play 5, 6, 7, 8 games, we can look at. We're always looking at the impact of the schedule on potential injury and trying to tweak for that. But I think in some sense for some teams, given the nature of their buildings, longer road trips are the reality of it. But we do try to put governors on that. So we don't have teams making 9, 10 game road trips historically. I think we try to keep it around 7 or 8. And the teams are typically okay with that.
In an earlier session, they were talking about some teams are choosing to fly that night, some teams are choosing to fly in the morning.
Yeah.
How do you factor that into rest times and off days?
Yeah, it's a great question. So our current policy is that as long as a team gets to the city where they're playing the next game the night before the game, effectively, they can travel whenever they want. And what that means is if you've got a day, if you're playing a Monday night at home and a Wednesday night on the road, that team can choose to fly Monday right after the game, or they can choose to fly on Tuesday. Back-to-back games, you obviously have to fly right after the game because we need to make sure that the team gets to the next city. But that's entirely a team conversation, and I think every team has different preferences. There's some sleep studies that are out there now that'll say it's better to get the rest going, the next day. But if you heard the panel this morning, Scalabrini said, well, that doesn't always mean rest. It just means you're physically in the same place. So that's really a team decision. But for us, it's more about how do we create those periods of rest throughout the calendar so at any given week, month, or half of a season, a team schedule isn't too dense. I think we have time for one more, maybe. How about over here?
Can you talk about the lockout short season and the challenges that schedule adjustments present? Like, do you guys have
Yeah. So I wasn't personally involved then, but I can speak generally. I mean, essentially, it was literally a day-to-day process, right? Because every day we lost in the lockout probably meant a different number of games. So once we canceled the first 2 weeks of the season, we knew we weren't going to play 82 games. Once we canceled 2 more, now we can't play 76. So there were these contingencies going on a day-to-day basis, which I think probably had Matt Winnick in the office 24 hours a day, building every possible schedule we could. Again, not to just tout the new approach, but we could have all that built in, right? So we could say, as we potentially go into any work stoppage in the future, what's the length of the season going to be? On any given date, we know how many games we could get in. And to reiterate what I said before, it becomes more plug and play. That if we start by December 10th, if we start by January 1st, et cetera, here's the schedule we could get. But obviously, our hope would always be to avoid work stoppages and play a full season. I think we're out of time, but I want to thank everyone for coming and happy to answer any questions afterwards. Thanks.